February 11th, 1944, 2300 hours. Approximately 80 miles northwest of Truk Lagoon, Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Mori stood on the bridge of the destroyer Maikaze, watching American carrier aircraft burn on the horizon. 3 confirmed kills. His ship's anti-aircraft crews had performed admirably during the daylight raid, throwing up walls of fire that forced the enemy bombers to scatter. The Type 96 25mm guns had chattered without pause for 20 minutes. Hundreds of rounds expended. 3 aircraft destroyed. This was normal. This was what anti-aircraft warfare required. Volume of fire, saturation, creating zones of flying metal through which no aircraft could pass unscathed. Mori's gunners were among the best in the fleet, trained to track targets visually, to lead their shots, to fire in coordinated bursts. They understood their craft, what Lieutenant Commander Mori did not understand. What none of his officers could explain was why American ships seemed to destroy Japanese aircraft with uncanny efficiency while firing far fewer shells. In 3 separate night actions over the past 6 months, Mori had observed American task forces repelling Japanese air attacks with what appeared to be impossibly accurate anti-aircraft fire. The American shells burst at exactly the right altitude, at exactly the right moment, as if guided by some invisible hand directly to their targets. Tonight, observing the burning wrecks through his binoculars, Mori noticed something else. The American anti-aircraft bursts formed perfect spherical clouds of shrapnel. They appeared in the sky near Japanese aircraft, even when those aircraft were taking evasive maneuvers. The shells seemed to explode at optimal distances, regardless of whether American gun crews had time to properly calculate firing solutions, in darkness, through cloud cover, with consistent, devastating accuracy. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. This should not have been possible, but increasingly, it was becoming the reality of naval warfare in the Pacific, and Lieutenant Commander Mori, like many Japanese officers, was beginning to suspect that something fundamental had changed in the nature of anti-aircraft combat, something his training and experience had not prepared him for. The suspicion would prove correct, but the full scope of American technological superiority would not become clear until after the war ended, when Japanese technical officers finally examined captured examples of the weapon that had decimated their air forces. What they discovered would reveal not merely a clever innovation, but evidence of an industrial and technological gap so vast that it challenged fundamental assumptions about Japan's ability to wage modern war. The American proximity fuse represented more than tactical advantage. It embodied systematic American superiority in miniaturization, mass production, quality control, and the integration of cutting-edge physics with battlefield applications. By the time Japanese researchers held the first intact examples in their hands in 1945, they were examining technology that made their own anti-aircraft systems obsolete by standards they had not imagined possible. To understand the magnitude of this disparity, one must first understand what Japanese anti-aircraft doctrine demanded, and how thoroughly American technology had rendered those demands irrelevant. Japanese anti-aircraft development in the 1930s had followed logical paths based on the technology available at the time. Heavy anti-aircraft guns used timed fuses that required gun crews to calculate the exact moment of detonation based on target altitude, speed, direction, and ballistic trajectory. These calculations were complex but achievable with proper training. Fire direction equipment. The Type 88 75mm anti-aircraft gun, standard equipment on Japanese warships and coastal installations, represented respectable engineering. The weapon fired a shell weighing 6.4 kilograms to an effective ceiling of 9,000 meters. Its mechanical time fuse could be set with reasonable precision by trained crews. In doctrine and design, it mirrored anti-aircraft weapons used by every major naval power at the war's beginning. Japanese naval anti-aircraft fire control centered on the Type 94 Director, an optical range-finding system that allowed operators to track targets and compute firing solutions. The system worked adequately against aircraft flying steady courses at medium altitudes. it struggled against high-speed maneuvering targets. It became nearly useless at night or in poor visibility when optical tracking failed. After the disaster at Midway in June 1942, where Japanese carriers were destroyed largely because defending fighters proved inadequate, the Imperial Japanese Navy rushed development of improved fire control systems. The Type 3 director promised better tracking and faster computation of firing solutions. Development began with high priority. Resources were allocated. Talented engineers worked on the project. The prototype was never completed. Not because of engineering failure, but because Japanese industrial capacity simply could not support the level of precision manufacturing required while simultaneously producing ships, aircraft, weapons, and ammunition for forces spread across the Pacific. The gap between design and production, between laboratory prototype and fleet deployment, proved unbridgeable with the resources available. This was the first hint of a larger problem. Japanese military technology could conceive advanced systems. Japanese scientists understood the relevant physics. But the industrial infrastructure to translate concepts in hundreds or thousands of production units deployed across an entire fleet did not exist at the necessary scale. Light anti-aircraft weapons faced similar constraints. The Type 96 25mm gun, based on a French Hotchkiss design, served as the primary close-range anti-aircraft weapon on Japanese vessels. The weapon was mechanically sound. Reliability was acceptable. Rate of fire reached 220 rounds per minute in sustained bursts. But fire control remained primitive, relying on open-ring sights that required gunners to visually track targets and estimate lead angles manually. The Type 95 director provided some automated fire control for triple 25mm mounts, but only for those specific installations. Single and twin mounts, which comprised the majority of light anti-aircraft weapons aboard Japanese ships, relied entirely on human eye and judgment. In an era when aircraft speeds were increasing and attack profiles becoming more sophisticated, this represented a significant vulnerability. Japanese doctrine compensated for technological limitations through volume. More guns, more shells, more crew training. If a single gun crew firing manually aimed bursts had a low probability of hitting a maneuvering aircraft, then installing dozens of guns would increase hit probability through sheer volume of fire. The math was straightforward, even if the solution was inelegant. This approach consumed enormous quantities of ammunition. A typical heavy anti-aircraft engagement might see Japanese ships fire thousands of shells to achieve a handful of kills. Light anti-aircraft weapons expended ammunition at even more prodigious rates. Ships returned to port with magazines depleted, having thrown metal into the sky with the desperate hope that some fraction would find targets. But ammunition expenditure was acceptable if it achieved results. The real problem emerged when American anti-aircraft fire began achieving dramatically better results while firing far fewer shells. Japanese observers reported American ships destroying multiple attacking aircraft with precisely placed bursts that appeared to explode at optimal distances regardless of visibility conditions or target maneuvers. The disparity could not be explained by superior training or better optical range-finding. Something else was at work. Initial Japanese intelligence assessments suggested Americans had developed superior optical systems, perhaps new rangefinders with enhanced magnification, perhaps improved fire directors with faster mechanical calculators. These explanations fit within the framework of existing technology. They suggested incremental improvements rather than revolutionary change. Some reports speculated about American radar use in fire control. Japan had developed radar systems by 1942, though deployment remained limited and integration with weapons systems minimal. The idea that Americans might be using radar to guide anti-aircraft fire seemed plausible. It still represented technology within the bounds of what Japanese engineers understood, even if American implementation was more advanced. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Neither explanation approached the truth. The American proximity fuse did not represent incremental improvement or better integration of existing systems. It represented a category shift in the fundamental nature of anti-aircraft warfare, and, crucially, it represented a manufacturing and production achievement that revealed just how far American industrial capability exceeded Japanese capacity. The development of the American proximity fuse began in August 1940, more than a year before Pearl Harbor, when the National Defense Research Committee assigned the project to Dr. Merle Tuve at the Applied Physics Laboratory of Johns Hopkins University. The concept was deceptively simple. Create a miniature radio transmitter and receiver that could fit inside an artillery shell, detect proximity to a target through radio wave reflection, and automatically detonate the explosive charge at optimal distance. The concept had been discussed in military journals for years. Multiple nations had attempted development. All had failed because the technical obstacles seemed insurmountable with 1940s technology. Vacuum tubes were fragile glass constructs that shattered under far less stress than artillery shells endured. Batteries powerful enough to run radio equipment were too large to fit in shell casings. The radar antenna needed to be impossibly small, yet still functional. And all of this technology had to survive acceleration forces of 20,000 times gravity when fired from a naval gun. American researchers solved these problems not through individual genius, but through systematic industrial organization that brought together university laboratories, private industry, and military requirements in focused collaboration. The Massachusetts Institute of Technology Radiation Laboratory employed over 4,000 scientists and engineers working on radar development alone. The Applied Physics Laboratory Section T, dedicated to proximity fuse development, grew to nearly 1,000 researchers and support staff. This concentration of scientific talent working on a single weapons program exceeded the total research capacity Japan could devote to all weapons development simultaneously. The difference was not in scientific understanding. Japanese physicists comprehended the relevant principles. The difference lay in industrial depth and the ability to translate laboratory success into mass production. By mid-1942, American researchers had developed vacuum tubes that could survive gun firing through revolutionary design changes. Multiple internal supports reinforced the delicate structures. Special gas mixtures prevented electrical arcing under extreme stress. The tubes were embedded in carefully formulated wax and oil compounds that distributed shock forces. Failure rates remained high, but enough tubes survived testing to prove the concept viable. The battery problem was solved through counterintuitive engineering. Instead of trying to make batteries more robust, engineers created batteries that assembled themselves during firing. A small glass ampule contained liquid electrolyte, kept separate from metal contacts. When the gun fired, acceleration forces shattered the ampule and centrifugal force. From the shell's spin drove the liquid outward to contact metal plates, generating electrical current through chemical reaction. The battery literally activated itself through the forces that threatened to destroy it. The radar system required innovations that pushed the boundaries of electronics miniaturization. The transmitter and receiver had to share a single tiny antenna no larger than a pencil. The circuitry needed to distinguish between transmitted signals and much weaker reflections bouncing back from targets. Engineers developed an autodyne detector circuit that could sense minute changes in signal strength as the shell approached its target. When reflected, signal strength exceeded a specific threshold, indicating proximity to the target. The firing circuit triggered detonation. By January 1943, the system worked reliably enough for combat deployment. The USS Helena, equipped with proximity-fused 5-inch anti-aircraft shells, engaged 4 Japanese Aichi-D, 3A, dive bombers off Guadalcanal on January 5th. The cruiser fired a total of 3 shells from her after battery. 2 dive bombers were destroyed without the shells making physical contact. The shells simply exploded near the aircraft, and shrapnel did the rest. This represented more than improved efficiency. It represented transformation of anti-aircraft warfare from an exercise in probability to precision engagement. Traditional time-fused shells required approximately 2,000 rounds fired to destroy a single aircraft under typical combat conditions. Proximity-fused shells required between 300 and 600 rounds depending on tactical circumstances. The improvement factor ranged from 3 to 7 times more effective, varying with specific engagement conditions. The impact on naval operations became apparent quickly. Admiral William Halsey, commanding naval forces in the South Pacific, reported that Japanese night torpedo bomber attacks, which had terrorized American forces throughout 1942, suddenly became far less effective. Proximity-fused shells, guided by radar fire control, could engage aircraft in complete darkness at ranges where optical systems were useless. Japanese pilots who had used darkness as protection found themselves just as vulnerable as in daylight. But the full story of the proximity fuse was not merely technological achievement, it was industrial accomplishment at a scale Japan could not match. By August 1942, the Crosley Corporation alone was producing 500 proximity fuses daily. By December 1943, production reached 3,000 units daily. At peak production in April 1945, Crosley manufactured 16,500 fuses every 24 hours. Crosley was one of 5 companies that assembled complete fuses. A total of 87 different firms using 110 factories participated in component production. Over 100,000 workers, most unaware of what they were building, produced parts to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Sylvania Electric Products operated a plant in Ipswich, Massachusetts, employing 10,000 workers in 3 shifts, producing 95% of all proximity fuse vacuum tubes. The plant consumed enough electricity to power a small city and produced approximately 1 million tubes every 2.5 days at peak output. By war's end, American industry had manufactured 22 million proximity fuses. The cost per unit dropped from $732 for hand-assembled prototypes to $18 for mass-produced versions. This 40-fold cost reduction through manufacturing efficiency meant proximity-fused ammunition could be deployed in vast quantities across the fleet without prohibitive expense. Japanese industry possessed no equivalent capacity. The industrial infrastructure required to produce precision electronics at this scale, while maintaining strict quality control, simply did not exist. Japan could design sophisticated systems. Japanese vacuum tube manufacturers produced quality components for radio equipment, but the systematic integration of research, development, and mass production that characterized American weapons programs had no parallel in Japanese industrial organization. This disparity became brutally apparent in combat results. During 1943, American naval forces credited proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire with more than half of all Japanese aircraft destroyed, despite proximity fuses, equipping only 25% of ammunition expended. The mathematics were clear and devastating. For every aircraft destroyed by time-fused shells requiring an average of 508 rounds, proximity-fused shells achieved kills with 155 rounds. The effectiveness increased against kamikaze attacks, beginning in October 1944. Kamikaze pilots flew predictable straight-line trajectories directly toward targets, unable to take evasive action without abandoning their mission. This played directly to proximity fuse strengths. 5-inch guns firing proximity-fused ammunition required only 310 rounds per kill against kamikaze attackers, compared to 624 rounds per kill against conventional attacks. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 demonstrated American air defense capability at fleet scale. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded Japanese carrier forces attempting to use superior aircraft range to strike American carriers while remaining outside American strike range. The plan depended on Japanese scouts locating American forces first, and Japanese strike aircraft avoiding American combat air patrol during approach. Neither assumption held. American radar detected Japanese scout aircraft at extended ranges. When Ozawa launched his first strike wave of 69 aircraft on June 19th, American radar detected the formation while it was still assembling over Japanese carriers. By 1000 hours, American fighter directors had vectored Hellcats to intercept positions calculated for maximum defensive effectiveness. The Japanese strike ran into coordinated defense with fighters positioned by radar guidance and ships' anti-aircraft batteries, firing proximity-fused shells that created walls of exploding shrapnel through which attacking aircraft had to fly. Of 69 aircraft in the first AF wave, only 27 survived to return to their carriers. Not one landed a hit on American ships. Ozawa launched 3 more strikes that day. The second wave of 129 aircraft lost 97 to American defenses. The third wave of 47 aircraft lost 27. The fourth wave of 82 aircraft lost 73. By day's end, Japan had lost 346 carrier aircraft in combat. American combat losses totaled 29 aircraft. The numbers told a story of systematic slaughter. Japanese formations were being destroyed with industrial efficiency. Each wave received identical treatment: radar detection at long range, fighter direction to optimal intercepts, coordinated attacks breaking up formations, and anti-aircraft fire guided by radar tracking and enhanced by proximity fuses, creating kill zones through which aircraft could not pass. The system worked, regardless of how many aircraft Japan launched or what tactics they employed. From Ozawa's perspective aboard carrier Taiho, the battle was incomprehensible disaster. Strike after strike departed to attack American carriers. None achieved significant hits. Few aircraft returned. Radio communications from strike leaders indicated they were under attack by fighters who seemed to know exactly where Japanese formations would be, and by anti-aircraft fire of uncanny accuracy that exploded near aircraft, even when gunners had no direct visual contact. The psychological impact on surviving Japanese pilots was profound and immediate. Lieutenant Masatake Okumiya, a carrier division commander who would later write extensively about Japanese naval aviation, noted in post-war writings that, after the Philippine Sea, Japanese pilots increasingly felt they were fighting an enemy who could see them coming from impossible distances and whose anti-aircraft guns destroyed aircraft without actually hitting them. This was not superstition or defeatist thinking. It was accurate assessment of capabilities Japanese forces faced. The question that haunted Japanese military analysts was simple yet terrible. How had the Americans achieved such devastating superiority in anti-aircraft capability? The answer, when it finally came after Japan's surrender, would reveal a technological gap measured not in years, but in fundamental industrial and scientific organizational capacity that Japan could not have bridged even with decades of focused effort. The full magnitude of American anti-aircraft superiority became undeniable during the Battle of Okinawa from April to June 1945. Japan threw everything remaining at the Allied fleet supporting the invasion. Nearly 2,000 kamikaze sorties attacked American ships over 3 months of desperate fighting. The Japanese called these mass attacks kikusui, meaning floating chrysanthemum, and launched 10 major waves. On April 6th alone, 355 kamikaze aircraft attacked the fleet. The scale was unprecedented and initially overwhelming. American naval forces suffered the highest casualties of any Pacific campaign. 26 ships were sunk and 164 damaged. Nearly 5,000 sailors died, and another 5,000 were wounded. But without proximity fuses, the losses would have been catastrophic, rather than merely severe. Nearly 2/3 of all proximity fuses expended during the entire war were used in just 7.5 months of 1945. Most of them in the waters around Okinawa. Those Fuzes shot down over 1,200 Japanese aircraft that otherwise might have crashed into American ships. The mathematics were brutal and inescapable. American ships firing proximity-fused ammunition could engage kamikaze aircraft at maximum effective range and maintain sustained accurate fire throughout the engagement. Japanese pilots faced walls of exploding shells that detonated automatically at lethal distances. There was no evasion, no tactic, no amount of courage that could overcome the fundamental technological advantage American gunners possessed. Japanese military leadership watched these losses with growing understanding that something had changed in the fundamental nature of warfare. The Imperial Japanese Navy's top anti-aircraft specialists collected reports from surviving pilots and ship's observers. A pattern emerged that could not be explained by superior American training or better optical rangefinders, or even radar fire control alone. American anti-aircraft shells were behaving impossibly. They exploded at optimal distances from targets regardless of whether gun crews had time to properly calculate firing solutions. They functioned effectively in darkness, through clouds, in rain, and poor visibility. They created perfectly spherical bursts of shrapnel that maximized lethal radius, and most telling, they appeared to track individual aircraft, detonating only when in proximity to targets rather than at predetermined times or altitudes. Captain Atsushi Oi, a staff officer in the combined fleet who specialized in anti-aircraft warfare analysis, compiled these reports in late 1944. His assessment concluded that American anti-aircraft effectiveness had increased by factors that could not be explained through conventional improvements in fire control or ammunition. He theorized that Americans possessed some form of proximity detection system built into the shells themselves. The theory seemed almost fantastical. Building a radio transmitter and receiver small enough to fit inside an artillery shell was theoretically possible but practically insurmountable with existing technology. The vacuum tubes alone would need to be miniaturized to unprecedented sizes. They would need to survive acceleration forces that shattered conventional tubes instantly. The power supply would need to be compact, yet powerful enough to run radio equipment. The entire system would need to cost little enough for mass production as expendable ammunition. Captain Oi's report was received with skepticism by officers who found the technological requirements too extreme to be credible. If such a device were possible, surely Japanese scientists would have developed it. The fact that Japanese research had concluded proximity, fuses were impractical for artillery shells, suggested Americans could not have solved problems Japanese engineers had deemed impossible. This reasoning was fatally flawed. It assumed technological parity between American and Japanese industrial capability. It assumed similar levels of resources devoted to weapons research. It assumed comparable manufacturing precision and quality control. All of these assumptions were wrong, but the full extent of the disparity would not become clear until after the war ended. The first intact proximity fuses fell into Japanese hands through accidents of combat. American ships conducting shore bombardment occasionally had. Shells malfunction and fail to detonate. Some of these duds fell on Japanese-held territory rather than in the ocean. Recovery teams found the unexploded shells and transported them to technical intelligence units for examination. What Japanese ordnance specialists found when they carefully disassembled these shells was initially baffling. The nose of the shell contained a complex assembly of miniature electronic components, unlike anything in Japanese arsenal. Tiny vacuum tubes, smaller than anything Japanese manufacturers produced. A glass ampule containing liquid, apparently part of a self-activating battery system. An antenna arrangement of extraordinary compactness. Circuit boards with components mounted at densities Japanese electronics production could not achieve. The technical analysis teams recognized they were examining a proximity fuse using radio wave detection, but recognition of the principle did not translate to understanding how Americans had overcome the manufacturing obstacles. The vacuum tubes alone represented a mystery. Japanese tube manufacturers produced quality components for radio equipment and radar systems, but these tubes were designed for installation in equipment that would never experience acceleration forces. Making tubes survive the 20,000 times gravity acceleration of artillery firing seemed impossible. Lieutenant Commander Takeo Yoshimura, an electronics specialist attached to the Naval Technical Research Institute, was assigned to analyze captured proximity fuses in detail. His report, submitted in July 1945, just weeks before Japan's surrender, painted a sobering picture. The American proximity fuse represented not merely advanced engineering, but systematic integration of miniaturization, precision manufacturing, and quality control at scales Japanese industry could not match. Yoshimura's analysis noted that every component in the American fuse was manufactured to tolerances that exceeded Japanese industrial standards. The vacuum tubes used reinforcement structures Japanese manufacturers had not conceived. The battery activation system was ingenious in its simplicity, yet required precision, glasswork, and chemical formulation beyond Japanese capability to replicate quickly. The circuit design was elegant and efficient, using fewer components than Japanese engineers would have required for equivalent functionality. Most telling was Yoshimura's assessment of manufacturing scale. The Americans were clearly producing these fuses in massive quantities. The quality control was consistent across multiple examples examined. This indicated not laboratory prototypes or limited production runs, but full industrial manufacture with systematic quality assurance. Yoshimura estimated American production capacity at tens of thousands of units monthly, possibly more. His conclusion was devastating. Japanese industry lacked the capability to replicate American proximity fuses within any time frame that would affect the war's outcome. Even with working examples to study, even with complete understanding of the principles, Japanese manufacturing could not produce equivalent devices in quantity. The gap was not in scientific knowledge, but in industrial infrastructure and production capacity. This assessment never reached wide distribution. Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, before Yoshimura's report could influence planning or resource allocation. But the analysis proved prescient. When Allied technical intelligence teams interviewed Japanese scientists and military specialists after the surrender, they found universal acknowledgement that American anti-aircraft technology had been impossibly advanced. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey conducted extensive interviews with Japanese military and industrial leaders in the months following surrender. The section devoted to anti-aircraft warfare revealed the full extent of Japanese confusion about American capabilities. Multiple interviewees described American anti-aircraft fire as uncannily accurate, as if shells were guided directly to targets. The concept of proximity fuses came as revelation rather than confirmation of existing suspicions. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, who had organized the first kamikaze units, told interrogators that Japanese pilots increasingly reported American anti-aircraft fire that seemed to explode near aircraft, regardless of evasive maneuvers. He had theorized Americans possessed superior radar fire control. The idea that shells contained their own targeting systems had not occurred to him as plausible with 1940s technology. Lieutenant Masatake Okumiya, who survived the war and became one of the most important interpreters of Japanese naval history, provided detailed analysis of how proximity fuses had affected Japanese operations. His assessment was that proximity fuses had increased American anti-aircraft effectiveness by factors of 5 to 7 times compared to conventional ammunition. This matched American operational research almost exactly, validating both Japanese observations and American assessments. But Okumiya's most important insight concerned industrial capability rather than tactical effectiveness. He noted that Japanese naval aviation had been defeated not through lack of courage or poor tactics, but through systematic technological inferiority across multiple domains. Radar gave Americans detection advantages. Fire control systems gave them targeting advantages. Proximity fuses gave them engagement advantages. Each advantage individually was significant. Combined, they were overwhelming. The proximity fuse represented the culmination of American industrial and scientific advantages that Japanese forces faced throughout the Pacific War. It embodied miniaturization that Japanese electronics industry could not match. It required precision manufacturing that Japanese quality control could not achieve, but consistently. It demanded production scales that Japanese industrial capacity could not support, while simultaneously building ships, aircraft, and conventional weapons. The post-war examination of Japanese anti-aircraft technology revealed just how wide the gap had become. Japanese Type 96 25mm guns used open ring sights requiring manual target tracking and lead calculation by individual gunners. American 40mm Bofors guns used power-assisted directors with radar input that automated much of the tracking and aiming process. The difference was not incremental improvement but categorical transformation of fire control capability. Japanese heavy anti-aircraft guns used mechanical time fuzzes that required manual setting before firing based on calculated target altitude and speed. American 5-inch guns could use proximity fuses that eliminated manual calculation entirely and automatically detonated at optimal distances. Japanese fire control directors used optical rangefinding with mechanical computation. American directors integrated radar ranging with automated ballistic calculation and could engage targets beyond visual detection range. The cumulative effect was that Japanese and American anti-aircraft systems were not merely at different points on a linear progression of capability. They represented fundamentally different approaches to the problem of aerial defense, with American systems incorporating automation, electronics integration, and precision manufacturing at levels Japanese industry could not achieve. The disparity extended beyond hardware to production philosophy. American proximity fuse development involved systematic collaboration between university laboratories, private industry, and military requirements. Section T at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory employed nearly 1,000 people working exclusively on proximity fuse development. The Massachusetts Institute of Technology Radiation Laboratory employed over 4,000 people working on radar applications. This concentration of scientific talent on specific weapons programs exceeded total Japanese research capacity devoted to all military development. Japanese weapons development remained fragmented. Different services competed for limited resources. Research laboratories worked in isolation with minimal coordination. The bridge from laboratory prototype to factory production was never built with the systematic thoroughness Americans achieved. Brilliant individual innovations remained trapped in research facilities, while American innovations moved rapidly from concept to mass deployment. Dr. Yoshio Nishina, Japan's leading nuclear physicist and director of the Army's atomic bomb research program, told American interrogators after the war that Japanese science understood the theoretical principles behind most advanced American weapons. What Japan lacked was not scientific knowledge, but industrial capacity to translate knowledge into deployed systems at scale. His assessment applied perfectly to anti-aircraft technology. Japan had developed radar by 1942. Japanese radar research was scientifically sound, but Japanese radar remained primarily laboratory equipment through most of the war. Fleet deployment was limited. Integration with weapons systems was minimal. Manufacturing capacity was insufficient to equip more than a small fraction of ships with radar, while simultaneously producing conventional equipment. The same pattern appeared in fire control development. Japanese engineers designed advanced directors with improved tracking and calculation capability. Prototypes were built and tested, but translating prototypes into hundreds of production units that could be installed fleet-wide proved impossible with available resources and manufacturing capacity. The gap between design and deployment was unbridgeable. The proximity fuse represented the ultimate expression of this disparity. Japan had capable scientists who understood radio principles and vacuum tube physics. Japanese researchers had considered proximity fuse development, but the engineering obstacles, the manufacturing requirements, and the quality control demands made the project impractical given available resources. American researchers faced identical obstacles. They overcame them through systematic industrial organization and manufacturing investment at scales Japan could not match. By 1945, the technological gap had expanded to dimensions that made meaningful Japanese resistance impossible through conventional means. American ships routinely operated with comprehensive radar coverage, providing detection, tracking, and fire control capability. Combat information centers synthesized data from multiple sources to create complete battlefield awareness. Proximity-fused ammunition made anti-aircraft fire 3 to 7 times more effective than conventional shells. Japanese ships in the same period still relied primarily on optical fire control with minimal radar integration. Night operations remained high risk, because detection and engagement capability degraded severely in darkness. Anti-aircraft effectiveness remained dependent on volume of fire rather than precision engagement. The disparity was not merely quantitative but qualitative, reflecting different levels of technological sophistication and industrial capability. The human cost of this disparity was measured in thousands of Japanese pilots and aircrew who died attacking American forces that possessed systematic advantages they could not overcome through skill or courage. At Okinawa, Japanese aircraft losses exceeded 1,200 to proximity-fused fire alone. These pilots faced weapons that detected them at distances beyond visual range, engaged them with automated fire control, and destroyed them with ammunition that required no direct hit to be lethal. The strategic implications were equally profound. The proximity fuse validated an approach to military technology development that would define American defense policy for decades. Invest in technological superiority, accept high development costs to achieve decisive advantages. Integrate research, development, and production through systematic organization. Deploy advanced capabilities at scale across entire forces rather than in limited numbers. This philosophy proved its worth in the Pacific War. The proximity fuse contributed to destroying Japanese naval aviation, protecting invasion fleets, and enabling operations that would have been impossible or prohibitively costly without technological advantage. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal stated that the proximity fuse helped blaze the trail to Japan. General Dwight Eisenhower wrote in his memoirs that if Germans had perfected proximity fuses 6 months before the Allies, the invasion of Europe would have been exceedingly difficult, perhaps impossible. These were not casual observations from commanders known for hyperbole. They were strategic assessments from the highest levels of military command about weapons whose impact on operations had been decisive. The proximity fuse changed what was possible in anti-aircraft warfare. It made darkness and poor visibility irrelevant. It transformed defensive fire from probability exercise to precision engagement. It forced attacking aircraft to penetrate kill zones that could not be evaded through maneuver or tactics. For Japanese forces facing this technology without equivalent capability, the experience was one of systematic disadvantage that could not be overcome through training, dedication, or tactical innovation. Lieutenant Commander Yoshimura's post-war assessment captured the reality starkly. American proximity fuses represented technology 15 to 20 years ahead of Japanese capability in miniaturization, precision manufacturing, and electronics integration. This was not hyperbole but measured, technical judgment from a specialist who had examined the evidence directly. The legacy of the proximity fuse extended far beyond World War II. Every modern anti-aircraft missile uses proximity fusing as standard equipment. The Patriot missiles that defended against Scud attacks in the Gulf War used proximity fuses descended directly from the Mark 32 developed in 1942. Naval close-in weapons systems like phalanx that protect ships from missile attack employ proximity fusing. Air-to-air missiles, carried by fighter aircraft worldwide, detonate using proximity fuses. The technology pioneered under desperate wartime conditions became fundamental to all modern air defense. The industrial model that created the proximity fuse, bringing together university research, private industry, and military requirements in focused collaboration, became the template for American military technology development throughout the Cold War and beyond. The scientists who developed the proximity fuse shaped American science for generations. Dr. James Van Allen, who worked on rugged vacuum tube development for Section T, later discovered the radiation belts bearing his name. Many Section T researchers became leaders in the space program. The Applied Physics Laboratory at Johns Hopkins, created for the Proximity Fuse project, continues as a leading defense research institution. Most importantly, the proximity fuse demonstrated that decisive military advantages could emerge from systematic investment in technology. The project cost over $1 billion in 1940s currency, roughly $15 billion in modern terms. This was enormous expenditure for a single weapon system, But the return on investment was measured in thousands of American lives saved and operations enabled that shaped the war's outcome. For Japanese military forces, the proximity fuse represented the culmination of technological disadvantages that had accumulated throughout the Pacific War. Each individual American advantage, radar, automated fire control, proximity fuses, was significant. Combined, they created systematic superiority that Japanese forces could not counter with existing capabilities. By war's end, the technological gap had expanded to dimensions that made continued resistance militarily futile. The officers who examined captured proximity fuses in the final months of the war understood this reality with painful clarity. They were examining technology their nation could not have produced within any relevant time frame. Not because Japanese scientists lacked understanding of the principles, not because Japanese workers lacked skill or dedication, but because the industrial infrastructure required to translate advanced physics into mass-produced weapons simply did not exist at necessary scales. This was the fundamental lesson of the proximity fuse for Japanese military analysis. Modern warfare had become as much about industrial capacity and systematic technology development as about tactics, training, or courage. Nations that could integrate scientific research, precision manufacturing, and mass production would possess decisive advantages over nations that could not, regardless of traditional military virtues. Lieutenant Commander Mori, who had observed American anti-aircraft effectiveness with confusion in February 1944, survived the war. In interviews conducted decades later, he described the moment he first examined a captured proximity fuse after the surrender. He held in his hands the answer to questions that had haunted him for 18 months. The device was smaller than he expected, more compact, more elegantly engineered. What struck him most was not the sophistication, but the obvious mass production quality. This was not a prototype or limited-run specialty item. This was industrial manufacture at scale. He understood in that moment that Japanese forces had been fighting an enemy whose industrial and technological capabilities exceeded Japanese capacity by margins that made defeat inevitable once the war moved beyond initial tactical successes. The proximity fuse was not the cause of that defeat, but it was perfect embodiment of the industrial and scientific advantages that determined the Pacific War's outcome. The shells that exploded near Japanese aircraft in 1944 and 1945 did so because American researchers solved problems Japanese engineers had deemed impractical. They did so because American industry could manufacture precision electronics at scales Japanese factories could not approach. They did so because American military leadership invested billions in weapons development and accepted high costs to achieve decisive advantages. These shells represented more than improved anti-aircraft capability. They represented a systematic American approach to modern warfare that privileged technological superiority over numerical parity, that accepted high development costs to achieve battlefield advantage, that integrated research and production through organized collaboration. This approach proved its worth in the Pacific War and would define American military doctrine for generations to come. For Japan, the proximity fuse was final proof that modern industrial war could not be won through spirit alone, through superior training alone, through tactical innovation alone. The nation that could translate scientific knowledge into deployed technology at scale, that could maintain systematic quality control across massive production runs, that could integrate advanced capabilities across entire military forces. That nation would possess advantages that skill and courage could not overcome. The 22 million proximity fuses produced by American industry during World War II helped secure victory in the Pacific. But their greater legacy was demonstrating that the future of warfare belonged to nations that could systematically develop and deploy advanced technology faster than enemies could adapt. In that competition, Japan had been outmatched from the beginning. The proximity fuse simply made that truth undeniable. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.